You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 285 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I got a lot of news to cover. There's a lot of things going on around the world and involving the U.S. military, which just isn't covered in the U.S. news, mostly because they get distracted with, whatever Nancy Pelosi is doing to become Speaker of the House again, or whatever, is going on with the Mueller probe that suggests Trump is going to be impeached soon, or that's, of course, what everybody gets excited about. And then, we have this potential government shutdown. So pretty much all the news is dedicated there, but there are a lot of very important things going on overseas and going to talk about on today's show. Share it, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. The Libertarian Institute has all my work, including my daily news roundup. Sometimes I post there on the blog or a featured article. For those of you who want the bonus content that I do produce, you can find it at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I've gotten an overwhelming, response in the past couple of months on Patreon. So thank you so much for those of you who are taking the time to donate to the show. If you've been thinking about it, maybe go ahead and sign up and do that and check out some of the bonus episodes I've been doing of the show. All right, so here we go on news. The first thing I want to talk about is a story in the United States. The Department of Justice is suing the fifth largest U.S. trucking shipping company in the U.S. I believe it's YRC. So they own Yellow and a couple other firms. And basically what they've been doing since 2013 is they send the Pentagon estimates. So they say, oh, you're shipping this, and this. It's going to weigh this much. And so this is how much we're going to charge you for it. And if it turns out when they loaded up the truck and the weight was higher than the estimate, then they would go ahead and adjust it and charge the Pentagon, a little bit more, whatever amount more. Because, when you're hauling things, weight's very important, hundreds of miles or whatever, and on these trucks, over time you're talking about a large shipping firm, you're talking about millions of dollars. However, when they weighed the truck and it turned out it was less than the estimate, they didn't then give the Pentagon a little bit of credit or, reduce the price of the shipping. They just, use the estimate number. So it's a pretty dishonest practice there. And the Department of Justice is now seeking, some money back there. I find the interesting thing, this has been going on since 2013 and nobody has noticed it. And we're talking about, millions of dollars of difference here. So you have to wonder, is there any corruption going on? Maybe you have some former execs of this shipping company that got, hired on the Pentagon at their logistics branch or whoever does the contracting. And so they're able to, make sure nobody looks at this number or kills it if anybody tries to run it up the flagpole. Or if it's just the fact that, this isn't their money. So, nobody really has an interest in worrying about the Pentagon budget. They could always go to Congress and get more if they want some. We saw this in the first year of the Trump term. He took office and he said, I want to extra $60 million. I think our billion and got even more than that. And so it's not like the Pentagon is ever really worried about how much they're spending on particular contracts. And so you would, I guess, expect that it's possible nobody just cares. It's a laziness issue. And then, of course, now you have the incentive on the side of the DOJ. Some prosecutor or some investigator wants to go get a promotion, then they could go after this company. And, so at least that way, I guess the American people aren't constantly getting screwed there. If you look at another big contract just got handed out by the Pentagon to OIS Systems. I guess they do stuff in healthcare and they're coming up with these healthcare monitoring systems. They're going to be paid $450 million over 5 years. I'd like to mention these contracts when I get them. That way, first of all, you could hear the names of the company that are doing business with the Pentagon. And, sometimes it's just a matter of one listener hears, OIS or OSI, what I think is the name of the company, had this contract. And then you hear later on that, this former exec of that company now has a role at a high paying role at the Pentagon or something like that. And this is definitely, story worthy, worth at least making a blog post or a tweet about somewhere. And so these kind of things could expose the corruption. Some other news going on in the White House. Mick Mulvaney is now the acting chief of staff. From my understanding, he doesn't seem like kind of a Bolton-aligned Republican. Not that I think that this guy is going to be anti-war and great for the anti-war movement, but if you kind of look at what's going on, I think in the White House now, my interpretation of politics is that aside from Ivanka and Jared, John Bolton seems to be the man with like a lot of power and influence as far as especially what information goes and who gets to sit in front of President Donald Trump. And so if Mulvaney is somebody who's not going to kind of fall in line with John Bolton, this could at least be something that wanes John Bolton's influence in the White House. And even if Mulvaney's not concerned about foreign policy, it could end up just kind of being a good thing there, but obviously not optimistic that Mick Mulvaney's going to come in and help Trump end any wars or anything like that. There's a great article in the American Conservative TAC, and I think it's actually by the staff there. And they write about how Sheldon Adelson's been a huge, backer and better on Donald Trump. He was somebody who donated a lot of money to the Trump and Republican campaigns. Famously, I think he gave some money to the inauguration. And his wife, I think her name is Miriam Adelson, recently just received a U.S. government medal award or some other nonsense for, whatever Trump decided to give it to her for. It really doesn't matter. But, this is like some glorification. She's probably a woman that feels good about it. But if you look at the moves that Trump has taken since becoming president when it comes to Israel-Palestine, allowing some expansion of settlements, and even though Trump had kind of at one point pointed out that these were getting in the way of a potential peace deal being done, if we look at what happened at the end of Obama's term as president, where the Obama administration actually stood up to the Netanyahu government right there at the end, while Trump has made a couple statements that weren't super favorable towards Israel, when we see the effects of his actual Israel policy, which is to ignore everything the Israeli government does, whether it's bomb Hezbollah targets in Syria, Iranian targets or Syrian government targets in Syria, the suppression of the protesters at Gaza, where they've killed over 160, I believe now is the count. People have been killed. Hundreds of people who have had limbs amputated, 60,000 protesters shot by live fire rounds, other thousands have been shot by rubber-coated steel bullets, and then tens of thousands have been, tear gassed. And this is for not even coming within 100 miles of the barbed wire reinforced fence that separates Gaza from the rest of Israel. And then, of course, I think we're seeing more and more settlement expansion in the West Bank. And from my understanding, there's going to be announcements possibly coming soon of Israel authorizing some new settlement expansions, and then also recognizing some settlements that some of the settlements in the West Bank are set up without really the permission of the Israeli government, but then they later recognize them. And so we're going to kind of have that de facto, legalization there of, what was at the time an illegal act. In line with talking about the suppression of protesters, there's a pretty interesting article in the BBC, and I'll link to it in the show notes page, where they talk about the increasing prevalence of tear gas being used. Now, I don't think that and a lot of times the editors do end up changing the titles for articles, so I'm not sure if the title really made sense, but the title is something along the lines of rapidly expanding use of tear gas. I think the article really ends up being taken to a direction where they talk about just the expanding use of, what they call non-lethal, or I think better labeled as less lethal weapons. These are things like tear gas, rubber-coated steel bullets. I've talked about the Israeli skunk water before. Things that tasers, in the case of kind of U.S. police, things that kill people less frequently than less likely to kill people than bullets do, but at the same time are no joke, serious weaponry. When we talk about the rubber-coated steel bullets, they have certainly killed people, causing internal bleeding or, broken bones. The cousin of Tamimi famously took one of these rounds to the face and had a quarter of his skull removed. Several people in the world have died from tear gas exposure over the past few years. I think some cases in Israel, some cases in either the West Bank or Gaza. Typically, what will happen is it's not actually suffocating to death from the tear gas, although that can happen, but people actually being hit by canisters. there was actually an anecdote in the article, a person interviewed who had been hospitalized for days after he was hit in the face with one. And then, a lot of these, I guess this amount of tear gas is produced at a facility in Pennsylvania. And in the article, unfortunately, you have a lot of apologizing. They interview this one woman in the community who's like, boy, I really like this tear gas facility there. And I think it's a great thing. And it brings us jobs and tax money. And so we need it. But, it would be interesting to see what the rest of the residents of the town say. There was one person interviewed who had a somewhat less favorable position, although they, only had like one line. It was basically just saying the plant doesn't really treat their employees well, low pay, stuff like that. There's been several accidents at this plant. It seems to cause a good amount of disruption in the community, with, them doing test fires. So you hear the rounds going off. One time there was a major leak and, kids weren't able to go home from school and stuff like that, in fear of being exposed to tear gas. The tear gas is shipped to regimes like in 2011 to the Egyptian regime, which was then used against protesters and the brutal repression of the protests there sparking at the very beginning there of the Arab Spring, of course, used by the Israeli government against the people there. I think one important thing here is on all those canisters, then they have like little Made in America signs. And so you had this guy, Noor, who was interviewed in the article saying that, a common thing to do is that they would pick up the tear gas canisters and they would say made in the US, made in the UK, made in China. And so, when the people of the United States say, oh, we're not doing anything to the people of Egypt, that's not what the people of Egypt feel when American-made tear gas canisters are raining down on them, given to the U.S., facilitated by our government to their very oppressive regime. And so I guess, the point of most of this is just to say that, this less lethal or non-lethal aid, whatever they are, not aid, I guess, weaponry, whatever they want to call it, really isn't great. It doesn't make it okay, right? It's not okay to tear gas a group of protesters who are going out there looking for their freedom by a repressive regime. And so it's very interesting that, I guess, first of all, the main woman from the town in Pennsylvania interviewed from the article never looks at the situation past her own community. She never says, boy, it's really terrible that those people in Egypt who are demanding more freedom and more democracy suffocated under the tear gas that the people in our town made. And then, our town benefit economically off of. That's not even in the calculation for her. All she cares about, and it's probably pretty representative and it's a pretty insightful thing, is just the community around her. Like, she doesn't care 5 miles from her own home what happens with this tear gas. And so it'll continue to oppress the people of the world. The weaponry is much more dangerous. I don't know why I keep saying aid, than people, pretend it is. And I think we have a vision of, and it really, I think for the people of the rest of the world, when they pick it up and see Made in America, facilitates that hatred against the United States. All right, got some good things to say. In North Korea here, we have a situation where I talked about on the show the destruction of, I believe, 22 guard posts along the DMZ, 11 on each side. And then you kind of, I think, which is a more ceremonial event here, you had groups of soldiers from South Korea cross over the DMZ into North Korea to inspect and make sure that that destruction was complete. And then you had the opposite happen. It seemed from all the reporting on it that all these interactions were peaceful and went well. It's not like, anybody, was being a jerk about what the other side did. They, said that the soldiers joked and shared cigarettes, and it seems like, they all did all right. My guess is that, these soldiers are probably handpicked by each government to make sure they would go and do the right thing. But, it is kind of a ceremonial thing to have, I think, for the first time ever, North Korean and South Korean soldiers cross the DMZ in peace and not hostility. So, when we're looking at steps taken here, and when I'm sure the people of North Korea, I would hope, get exposed to this, and the people of South Korea definitely find this out, it has to be harder and harder to, continue to even want to have the conflict with the other side, just because you're like, well, what's it all about? The North Koreans could cross into South Korea and nothing bad's going to happen. We just saw it happen on TV yesterday. And, these events, even though they're ceremonial, I think are so important and representative of the progress being made behind the scenes between the governments to actually move towards a less hostile Korean peninsula. recent statements from Trump and from North Korea seems that both are saying that they're willing to play the waiting game. North Korea says that Trump's maximum pressure campaign will not work, that they, I guess, will wait it out. The Trump administration is saying that they're in no hurry to make a nuclear agreement, and I think this was directly in a Trump tweet, with North Korea. So I guess it sounds like this could be taken one of two ways, that, they're willing to just kind of wait out North Korea, or Trump is saying that, we could make other steps first. We don't have to hurry up and get a nuclear agreement done. We could go ahead and get some other, peace reduction things going on here, like signing an official end, not just an armistice to the Korean War, possibly removing forces, from the DMZ, either South Korean or American forces, and possibly withdrawing some, more North Korean artillery positions or something like that. I think the good news is that I don't see either side really having any incentive to ramp back up tensions. That Trump is saying that, I'll wait is better than saying North Korea has 1 month to comply or I'm going to nuke them. The other good news, I think, is just that in South Korea, that the politics are for peace. Moon Jae-in is dedicated to this. It seems he's built most of his platform around it, and he's becoming increasingly popular. And the North Korean hots in South Korea are increasingly unpopular and losing seats in different elections. So we have a House vote here that was overwhelming to condemn the Myanmar government and label what they did against the Rohingya for a few weeks over the summer there, which I've called on the show an ethnic cleansing campaign as a genocide. Basically what happened is the Myanmar government targeted this group of Muslims who are a minority and who live in kind of like a northern province of Myanmar with an ethnic cleansing campaign. They tried to push them out of the country. They killed, I think, 6,700 is the number I see estimated, most of them along the way. I'm sure mostly innocent people. There are, some militant groups within the Rohingya. There's some ties to more jihadist and Islamic separatist type groups, like the Taliban or something like this, Al-Shabaab. However, this was a much wider campaign against the people by the Myanmar army. I guess the concern here is just that if the United States starts to take a more hostile position against the current Myanmar government, it might not actually help the Rohingya. And, I don't want the U.S. getting militarily involved here now in Southern Asia. This seems stupid. But at the same time, if we're just offering condemnations and maybe creating a legal situation in the United States where some of these people are now, free or prioritized and immigrating to the United States, that could be a positive. One of the issues here is that a lot of them end up in Bangladesh or India, where I don't think they're particularly welcomed by the native populations. And then you also just have a lot of poverty. So it's not like, they're have a lot of opportunity or resources for these refugee camps, because there's not a lot of opportunity or resources just for the people of these countries in some cases. There's also the issue of the imprisonment of the 2 Reuters journalists by the Myanmar government. They were actually, I think, one of the 4 Times People of the Year. What the Times did this year for People of the Year is kind of, honor the legacy of journalists killed on the job. So those 2 were honored, and then Jamal Khashoggi was another one. I think there's 2 other recipients. Kind of interesting that, Julian Assange isn't one that's on the list, an imprisoned journalist, but, it's because it's by the US and UK government, where, Khashoggi was killed by the Saudis. These people are imprisoned by the Myanmar government. So, even when the Times, tries to speak on behalf of the journalists, they often are still unwilling to speak that truth to the real powers in the world, like the United States and the United Kingdom. There's increasing pressure, and I think including some in the House bill I was talking about, identifying the genocide from international, different countries, the international community, to get Myanmar to release these journalists who were arrested while, I think, photographing and exposing some of the ethnic cleansing campaigns. Because right when it happened, there wasn't a lot of international coverage. The leader of Myanmar, her name is Aung. I forget the rest of her name there, but she was actually honored by the Obama government as being like one of these world leaders who's moving towards progress, which obviously didn't happen. She covered up, while she may not have direct control over the Myanmar army, she certainly worked to help cover up the crimes against the Rohingya people. Finally, though, some criticism has caught on. It's pretty obviously now been exposed that this was a cleansing campaign against this minority population, and so we're seeing more international criticism. So we have an interesting statement from the Turkish government, and what they're saying is that at the G20 summit, Erdogan, who's the president of Turkey, spoke with Trump, and Trump assured Erdogan that he was working on something to get Fatah Gulen extradited from the United States to Turkey. Now, Gulen's been hiding out in the United States for years. Erdogan alleges that he was behind a 2016 coup attempt against Erdogan, that he was organizing it, and has rounded up well over 100,000 people on allegations that they're Gulenites and that they were a part of the coup against him. From the U.S. side, in the past, it's been pretty much 100% from the establishment, including Donald Trump, that they're not looking to extradite Gulen. So either one, this is false. And that's interesting just based on the U.S.-Turkish relationship, and that Turkey would put, this false story that appeared in Reuters out there if it didn't happen at all, because it would seem to just be something to create pressure on Donald Trump to take this action. Or if, Trump is looking at his situation right now, I'm sure all of his advisors are telling him that the U.S. has to stay in Syria in order to counter Iranian influence there, or else they'll have a land bridge, as they all call it, but, really just a road or a path from Tehran to Beirut. And so the U.S. has to stay to protect Israel, from Iranian influence spreading through Syria. This is obviously a very stupid reason for the United States to stay in Syria, but I'm sure Donald Trump seems to now believe it. And the U.S. allies Turkey are threatening to attack the U.S.-backed forces in Turkey, which essentially give us, whatever legitimacy we claim to have for being there. So if our NATO allies in Turkey start attacking where U.S. troops are in Syria, this could create a lot of problems for the United States and Trump. So maybe Trump is looking to, get some, take some pressure off of Turkey from wanting to attack Syria by giving them Gulen. I mean, we certainly could be seeing some kind of deal like that, or it's just Donald Trump leading Erdogan along for whatever reason. But there's a very dangerous and interesting thing happening right now in eastern Syria here. I read a story in the Washington Post called The Secret War in Syria, which I found interesting as a title, just because I don't know how secret this war is. Maybe it is to everybody else, and it's just because I read the news all the time and actually know what's happening. But they say up to 4,000 U.S. troops are there, right? And so if you do have a situation where Turkey invades Syria, this may cause some conflict between the Turkish government and Assad and the Syrian government, between the United States and our NATO allies Turkey, especially since we've taken up observation posts along the Syrian and Turkish border to prevent this from happening. So it seems like, these forces are there as a tripwire, meaning that Turkey will have to kill them to, take Kurdish land. The Secret War in Syria piece also has some other interesting information along the lines of what seems to be a rising insurgency, kind of among the Arab populations in Syria east of the Euphrates River. Almost all this territory is held by the Syrian Kurds, minus some territory in southeastern Syria that's still held by ISIS. They have been unable, the SDF, the Kurdish forces there, to defeat ISIS in this region for well over 6 months. I've been talking about this on the show a lot lately. But even in other areas like Raqqa, which is a mostly Arab city, we're starting to, I think, see more opposition to the, what is now seen as a U.S. occupation in Syria. There's, I think, a lot of risk here that, with all these U.S. troops, up to 4,000 of them, and a potential growing insurgency, to see something like a Beirut attack, from, when you had the Marine barracks bombing there. If we have all these troops deployed there, and who knows what they could actually be doing, because do we really want, U.S. forces fighting against Assad or Russian mercenaries or Iranian Hezbollah forces, or do we want them fighting against ISIS when, the Kurdish forces could do that, or NATO allies? It doesn't make sense to me who exactly the U.S. forces are there to fight. And so they're just, mostly just stationed over there and maybe helping out with some training exercises. It seems like, they're in very dangerous territory if there's this growing insurgency. Other notes here, we just have this continued Turkish bombing of northern Iraq. This is Iraqi Kurdish territory. I believe the Iraqi government controls all the border crossings, but the rest of it, the different Kurdish militias hold, whether it be the Iraqi Peshmerga, the Syrian YPG, or the Turkish PKK. So Turkey bombs there, and they always claim to just kill some PKK militias. I guess finally the Iraqi government, since the defeat of ISIS, has enough kind of autonomy and control over northern Iraq that they could summon the Turkish ambassador and say, hey, you guys gotta knock off these airstrikes. Turkey, for their part, says they're keeping them up. And so here again, you kind of have a situation where the U.S. is in an interesting relationship with our NATO allies. You know, we try to be allies and supporters of the government in Baghdad as well, because this is the government that we built, even though it's leaned heavily towards Iranian influence at times. But now you have that government telling our NATO allies to knock off the airstrikes there, and our NATO allies saying, no, we're going to keep doing it. All right, so updates here on Yemen. SJ Res 54 passes. And it passes in, I think, a rather okay form. It seems like the poison pill kind of amendments that would have basically made it a meaningless bill all got shot down, and then some actually reinforcing amendments actually made it through. So it was good. The amendment process works. The Senate passes this. A round of applause to, I think, the 55 senators who voted for it. Great to see. First time, I think, since the War Powers Act was passed, in fact, that Congress has used it to exercise its war-making authorities granted by the Constitution. The bad news is it doesn't look like the House leadership is going to take it up until possibly the new Congress takes up in January. So this may not, be the immediate hopeful solution to end the war in Yemen, but it is a step in the right direction. And maybe with the Senate passing this bill, we can now look to start pressuring House leadership into taking action. Although Paul Ryan is kind of a lame duck now. I don't think he sought re-election actually. And so he will no longer be speaker, and probably doesn't have, we can't really politically pressure him. He could just do whatever the hell he wants. Now, there was a ceasefire reached from the Sweden peace talks, and this was for Hodeidah, 21 days. All the forces there are supposed to withdraw, both Yemeni government bad side and Houthi side, and then the UN would take control of the port. Overall, I mean, from the way I read this, this will be a win for the Houthis. This is a proposal that they have long advocated for. I feel like it would give them access to the aid that reaches that port, and would give the Saudis less excuses for being able to, put these ships through an essential blockade of, different inspections and rules and different things you had to do to be able to offload cargo at the port. And it would keep it out of the hands of Saudi Arabia, because what Saudi, I think, would want to do is have their, the forces they support take the city and then prevent any of that cargo being able to reach Houthi-held territories. Who knows how it'll naturally play out, though? I mean, we've seen so far in this war, Saudi Arabia being willing to do pretty much anything to win. So maybe the Houthis withdraw and they just swoop in and take it and, tell the UN to shove it. All right. So I guess I wish the ending there with the SJ-54 passing was a little bit more optimistic, but it's really a huge victory. And, it for the first, really 3 years of this war, it was all, grassroots activism trying to get the word out on it. Finally, now you have more mainstream sources picking up the humanitarian crisis here and all the other brutal things Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, in a lot of ways just because they're looking at, I think, getting back at Saudis over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. However, it is a win. It's a step in the right direction, and hopefully a step towards getting the U.S. to end its role in the genocide in Yemen. All right, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, immersionnews.com is my news website. I absolutely love the thing. Check it out. It's a great way, I think, to, kind of learn about what's going on in the world, all the different wars and stuff like that. And then on on minds.com, the name is Immersion News. Thanks, everyone.